Hello, Polly Samson, and welcome to the Great Big Book Club. And this is your fantastic book called A Theatre for Dreamers, which I've read in the proof copy. So sadly, I don't have the glamorous cover, which I presume you have. Do you have it there?
I do. Will it be backwards? But yes, it looks.
Oh, yes, it will be backwards. No worries, actually, I can read it perfectly. It's such a brilliant, fantastic book. Huge congratulations. And I just wondered, my first question, which is a sort of a weird one, but what's it like having a book out in lockdown?
It's really, really strange because you don't get to meet any readers.
Yes.
I mean, lovely in this situation. It's really lovely, and you cling on to anyone who wants to talk about the book. But normally at this stage, I'd have been, doing festivals and doing things in bookshops, and it would have been lovely because that's almost sort of the cherry on the cake of writing a book, is that bit where you get to talk face to face with people who get something in particular out of the book and want to talk to you about it. And it's very, very strange.
Yes. And all that hard work and everything, it's just like,
it's
very
just
difficult.
a very, very odd moment. Yeah, I mean,
but it is an absolutely it is an absolutely brilliantly wonderful book, and I've enjoyed every single minute of it. So can you tell me a bit about how you? I mean, I didn't realise. So it's set in the 60s in Hydra in Greece.
1960 in Idra. It's Idra.
Idra, sorry. And I had no idea that was such an incredibly bohemian community. Tell me a bit about that and a bit about how you came across the story.
Well, I came across the story because I went to Idra in 2014, and it was sort of the last family holiday, really. And my children were growing up, and I just wanted one last hurrah where they'd all come, and so they all agreed kindly to come with us. And we rented a house, and in the house was this book. It'll also be backwards, but it's his Charming Cliff's 1959 memoir of her life on Idra. And so
such a great title, that title.
Oh, she's such an amazing writer.
Yeah.
It's published the same year as Gerald Durrell's My Family and Other Animals, but amazing, the amazing thing is that has been out of print for a very, very long time. But she is an amazing writer, and she just hooked me in. And so as soon as I got back to England, I started researching her. And then Idra is a very odd place in some ways, in that Leonard Cohen, it's the place where Leonard Cohen has had his house. And I am the biggest Leonard Cohen fan and always have been. But when we were there, I had no idea that was the Greek island that Leonard Cohen had his house on. And so I got back, I researched Charmian's life. I then saw that she'd been there at the same time as Leonard Cohen. The next thing that happened was I got access to some photographs by a photographer who had documented the group. And I just started to get obsessed by them all, really. And I wanted to know who everyone was, because there are 1,500 of these photographs. And they are incredible photographs. And you just look at all these people frozen in time. And you look at Charmian with her head on Leonard's shoulder. And then you look at Marianne sort of sitting on the floor at his feet, grinning at him. And then the more I found out about the people, the more interested I got. And the more I wanted to know about how they related to each other. So that was how it started.
but that story of Leonard Cohen's affair with Marianne, how do you pronounce her surname?
Elin.
That's been picked over a few times, hasn't it, in documentaries and films? And I wondered why that was such a. I mean, what's brilliant is that as you're reading the book, every time her name is mentioned, all I can hear is the song. I mean, the word Marianne comes with that song, which is extraordinary. But what do you think is so beguiling about that story that everyone seems to be so fascinated by it?
Well, it's the song, I think, really. I think that is the answer. I think the song, once someone's name is immortalized in a song, they're forever linked to that person. And Leonard Cohen may have had several more important relationships in his life. In fact, I really believe he did. But, I think he's only got 2 songs with women's names in them. And one is Suzanne, who actually is not the Suzanne who he had his children with, but an earlier Suzanne who he was friends with in Montreal, and Marianne. And so they are forever. They have huge hit songs that have gone on, for for decades. And so I suppose, yeah, people really, really get fascinated when there's a girl in a song, I think.
And so your our way into this group of people is through your teenage girl called, isn't it, his name Edie? Oh, Erica. Sorry, Erica. And why did you do it like that? And is it because it's so difficult to write about real people sometimes that you need somebody else coming in, or did you write as she's a teenager, so you've had an interesting time writing as a teenage girl, I imagine, as well. I mean,
it's in a way that age. I've realised it's the second time I've written a novel with an 18-year-old protagonist, and I think it's a period of my life that's incredibly easy to connect to. It's so clear to me, that feeling of being 18. It's I think because it's a time of enormous change or something. For some reason, I can really connect to that feeling of being 18 and being on the brink of adulthood, and that sort of wobbly feeling of who am I going to be, what are my options, and that sort of wide open vista is actually terrifying. And that but the reason I wanted to have a fictional narrator, and the reason I sort of plumped on Erica, which was a real eureka moment, because I'd been sort of looking at how to write this novel for a couple of years by this point, but I really wanted to put the reader right in the middle of the foreign colony, because I wanted to sort of make it a really transformative book so that people would actually feel like they were there. And the only way you can do that is to have a pair of eyes that are right in there with all the people. And so, yes, Erica became that person, both as somebody to take the reader there, but also as somebody to look at women's lives, because it was the women's lives that particularly interested me, and particularly women at that period. It's between the first wave of feminism and the second. They had Simone de Beauvoir. It's another decade to go before Germaine Greer arrives on the scene, and it's that funny hinterland where women, there's still no pill, women still couldn't get a loan without a husband or a father to guarantee it. Women were in a really strange position, and yet the sexual revolution was already starting to rumble, but women were in such an odd position because they were the ones who were going to get pregnant, and they very hard to have an abortion, very hard to not, it takes a huge effort to not be pregnant if you're going to be part of this sort of sexual revolution. And I just thought it was a really, really interesting moment. So someone on the brink of being an adult at a time when women's lives were opening up, and at a time in a place where there was this fascinating proto-feminist, Charmian Clift, already living and writing and having these problems, and then the sort of surrendered woman in the form of Marianne Elan, who was very happy to just support the man in her life. Being able to contrast those two women and have Erica as someone who was arriving in this milieu and not knowing who she was, being such an unformed person who has really got no idea of what her future holds. So it was just, she was a tantalizing narrator for me, because she gave me everything I needed once I'd hit on her.
She's brilliant because she's like a sort of camera with a focus lens, and you can take her in and out, and she's terribly naive and yet sees extraordinary things. And I love there are many themes in the book, but one that really stands out is about you just talked about a tiny bit earlier about women fighting for their artistic space, and the idea that women were very much bound. I mean, there's the life on Hydra sounds very, very difficult. I mean, they had no electricity. They had electricity 2 hours a day or something. Is that right?
Yeah. And a lot of steps.
A lot of what?
It's precipitous. So whenever even when you go there today, it's the same. There's still no wheeled vehicles. Everything has to be either a donkey or on your own feet, and there's a lot of steps. So if you're in that, in 1960, they didn't have drinking water coming out of the taps. So you had to literally carry the water and tip it from one well on one part of the island, tip it into your great big stone jar, Kewpie jar. And, everything, every single bit of sort of food, everything had to be lugged, hundreds of steps. Hard work.
But it's practically medieval, a lot of the stuff. But there is a wonderful motif which you talk about, the gardenia and the sandwich, and I wondered if you would explain that a bit.
Yeah.
I think
Well,
it's so
that
beautiful.
was, yeah, well, Leonard Cohen, whenever he has been interviewed about that time, and he's asked about Marianne, the thing he always says is, oh, you know, it was the gold, she was the, you know, the golden wife of my youth and the golden days of Idra, when on my desk would be every day a fresh gardenia and a little sandwich, sweetness, sweetness everywhere. And that's a really sort of lovely image, except when you start thinking about the life of the woman who's, you know, I mean, either that give you enormous pleasure and you've got nothing else to do, or that's something I would find it that quite galling. There were moments when I was writing this book, I'd be in my shed and, you know, if you're really, really tired and really hungry, and I'd actually sort of text my husband with, where's my fucking gardenia then?
There is that sort of, because also now everyone keeps saying we're all in lockdown, surely it's going to be the most creative period of your life, you must be typing away, writing books. You're saying, oh no, you're not. You're making lunch, you're making breakfast, a rolling breakfast that appears to go on for 7 hours, and then it goes straight into lunch. I mean, you're constantly just feeding people, you know. And for us, you know, it's slightly easier because we do have electricity and running water, but it's been quite an uncreative period, I would say. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Yeah, well, it's just felt like really hard work. I think because the daytimes are all right. And actually, I've got something specific to do, which is that the brilliant actor who was going to do the audiobook, her nanny has got coronavirus, so she's not able to do it. But they still want to put the audiobook out for obvious reasons, because no one can get to a bookshop.
Yes.
So they said, could I do it? And I kind of blithely said, oh yeah, that'll give me something. It's such hard work. And of course, they've all got foreign accents and things. You know, I've got this completely international cast who all, and it's just trying to stop myself from doing these terrible accents so that everyone comes out sounding, you know, the Australian version of Dick Van Dyke. You know, it's just awful having to do this and having to listen to your own voice when you play it back. But that's the thing that's been keeping me really, really busy. Actually. It's every day. It's like going to work, going in, switching on the, you know, thing and starting to record. God, hats off to actors. I hadn't realised how difficult it is to do that.
And I agree. And how? Tell me a bit about your research that you did for this, because I mean, it's almost like slightly. It is historical fiction in a way. What you've done, if you've taken. I mean, it sounds so incredible. Their life. It sounded like a proper Bohemia. I mean, I don't know. And there are quite a few books that have been written on that period, aren't there? That you must have lapped up first of all.
Well, not on Idra, no. There were. I mean, the thing about the research was that a lot of them were writers, and writers write, and it was just elaborate. You know, it was labyrinthine because the first thing I did was I identified all the. You know, I decided I would stick to 1960 because that was a year of very particular dramas that I wanted to cover. It was the year that Charmian Clift and George Johnston came back to England. It was the year that Leonard met Marianne. There were all sorts of things that happened that year that were interesting. It was also a sort of very interesting year for Idra in that the sponge industry was finally over and they were having to embrace tourism. And so for all sorts of reasons, 1960 was a good year, but it was also the year of these photographs. And so I identified the people, and then I found that so many of them were writers, and they all had academic libraries. There, you know, several of them had several biographies written about them. I mean, you know, there's so many Leonard Cohen biographies, Marianne Eland biographies, Axel Jensen biographies in Norwegian. Reading completely, so I had to read sort of terrible translations. And you know, Goran Tunstrom, and all of these people wrote. All of these people have children who I've been in touch with. But the main thing I did was just get their letters and the biographies and the books, and it was just. The more I uncovered, the more there was to read. And I think in a way that this book was, I sort of just boiled it all down.
Yes.
Because actually what no one had ever really done before was to look at how they related to each other. So there would be a Leonard Cohen biography that would refer to Charmian and George, but it would be 2 sentences. And then there would be, you know, in the Charmian and George biography, you know, there would be it would say something like, "Oh, and a Canadian poet lived there," and then you'd think, "Oh, well, that's obviously Leonard."
Yeah.
Or, and so it's it's that thing of just trying to work out who they all were, and yeah, and
So like a forensic jigsaw puzzle, then, basically.
like that. It was because I kept finding them buried in each other's books. Also, it's mainly in things that they wrote themselves. But the thing about it is that the thing is that none of them were particular. I mean, George and Charmian were known already because they'd published quite a few books. But I mean, Leonard Cohen was a 25-year-old poet. He'd had one collection of poetry published. He was working on his first novel. He was on a Canadian government grant. It was his first time out of North America. No one knew who he was, so no one had any particular reason to sort of keep notes on this Canadian who'd turned up.
Yes.
So in fact, it was detective work, because it was kind of trying to find them. They all wrote letters and diaries, and you can find the things they thought about each other within those letters and diaries. But it's not this sort of, Charmian Clift and George Johnson didn't have this compulsion to write about Leonard Cohen, because he was just one of the young folk.
Yeah. And did I read that he was actually on the island on Hydra when you were there? Leonard Cohen, when you were thinking about researching the book, and then you realised it was his son.
Yeah, right? So that happened. Yes, no, that happened. I thought I'd time travelled. I was just sitting on my own having a coffee, and I kind of looked across the port, and I kept feeling like I was time travelling anyway. Yeah. And at one point, I wrote in the house where George Johnson and Charmian Clift had lived, and that was quite sort of strange. And then on this one occasion, I was having a coffee, and I looked across, and there was Leonard Cohen, who was already dead at this point. And I thought, oh, that's it. I've finally done it. I've broken through. And it was a sort of wobbly, frightening moment. And then I realized that it was Adam. And then my husband, who's a musician, kind of came back from where he'd been and sat down. And of course, there's that sort of famous musicians club. So at that point, Adam I was just sort of dying with embarrassment. Adam kind of went, "Hey, David." And then we ended up sort of having this sort of leisurely kind of, 11's coffee, another coffee, a beer, a cigarette, and all that time I was sitting there thinking, do I say something? Do I say something? Oh, this is so. And in the end, I thought, well, I can't meet someone for the first time and say, "Hey, I'm writing
about you."
So I didn't.
It's a little bit stalkerish, isn't it?
Yeah. So I didn't, and I mean, I'm bound to run into him again, actually.
And how fast and loose did you play with the facts? I mean, there must have been some things like, because I've written historical fiction as well, so I kind of know that there are certain moments where you have to be true to the characters. So whoever has sex with somebody did have to have had sex with somebody.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, because there's a wonderful moment in the book where Erica has a little bit of a fraught with Leonard Cohen at the end.
Yeah.
And I wondered how daunting it was to be dealing with real people, and how much fun to have.
Frotting Cohen.
In that it's a bit of a fraught at the end, isn't there? I haven't ruined the plot, by the way.
I mean, I just, if you read, biographies of Leonard, you can see it would be highly unlikely that wouldn't happen, actually, in my mind. True. I mean, the things I stuck absolutely to chronology. I tried to be as true to every fact as I could possibly be. I really did sort of. I set rules for myself. I broke my rules twice that I know of. Once was Gregory Corso. I very much wanted to place him there in the heat of summer, but in fact he'd been there 3 months earlier, and then he came back at the end of the summer. So I just moved him by 3 months to put him in a place I wanted him to be. Yeah. And the other thing I did was I wanted to have somebody I wanted to sort of explain the sponge industry, but in a way that was quite sort of in passing, but with some sort of emotional content to the idea of, it was a very risky thing to do. And so I needed somebody to have lost their husband to a sponge diver. So I made that Zoe, who is a real person, who was George and Charmian's housekeeper. And I mean, she wasn't married to a sponge diver who died. So that was another moment when I just, for the sake of the narrative, I just shifted something in. Yeah. But I think those are my only 2 crimes that I know of to history. But
you've subsequently gone on to buy a house in Hydra, yes? Yeah. Did you write a lot of it while you were there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, actual writing, probably more of that in my shed here.
Mm.
But yeah, no, lots of notes, which became, writing from there. I wrote quite a bit of George and Charmian in their house because it felt like a perfect opportunity to do that when when the person who owns the house said, "Why don't you come and stay here?" And we just swapped places, and I wrote there, and that I did feel like this would be a wasted opportunity to not write some of George and Charmian actually in George and Charmian's house, so I did,
Gosh.
which was wonderful.
Yeah.
But no, the main thing is, I mean, we sort of pretty much at the beginning of this, we ended up buying a house because my husband had always had a house in Greece, and then for the last sort of, I don't know, 15 years, he gave it to his older children, and we sort of stopped going, more or less. And but we both of us always had this sort of yearning to go back to Greece. And once I decided that I was going to take on this enormous project, I knew that I wanted to go every month of the year. So the first couple of times we went, we rented houses, and then the third time we just ran into someone who said, and we did that house tourism thing. We had no intention of buying a house, and we just walked into this, what's now our little house. It's a tiny little fisherman's sort of cottage, but we just walked in, and this sort of really amazing woman, actually, who knew Charmian, was moving out. Her family had it since 1963, and nothing had changed really, except that she traveled to India a lot and sort of filled it with nice cushions, and it just really felt like home. So we didn't even mean to. It was just this thing of, well, okay, we've got to be here a lot, so okay, let's this just feels really right. And oh my God, it's the best thing we ever did.
Oh. Well, you can tell because the writing, it reads like a love letter to
Yeah,
Greece.
yeah.
I mean, the smell, the colours. I mean, you're obsessed with smell, by the way. There's a wonderful thing when you would say that somebody smells of Nivea, and my mum used to use Nivea all the
My
time,
mum too.
and I
Yeah,
just smell it immediately, and
yeah.
it's gorgeous. Someone smells of cinnamon at some point. I mean, it's just it reads in such an incredible, magical way. I can't tell you how much I loved it.
Oh, thank you.
It's
That's so
a
nice. Thank
beautiful
you.
book. It's beautiful. It's the
Thank
closest you can get to going on holiday.
Oh, I know. Oh, may we all go on holiday again. I'm
I
longing to.
know, but I think I loved it, really loved it, and I also love the fact you sort of don't quite know whether you are in love with these Bohemians or not, because there's this wonderful bit where the father talks, Erica's father talks about them being talks about them being dissolute or something.
Yeah. Decadence.
Decadence, that's right, decadence instead of Bohemians, which I think
Yeah.
is just
Yeah.
brilliant. It's brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Can I just ask you, I've asked a couple of people some questions for you.
Yeah. Yeah,
So I've got here one from Julie Hogue, who runs Bookstoker Book Club. And she said, reading Theatre of Dreamers might be the closest any of us get to go to Greece this year. Are there any other recommendations that you have or substitutes for going somewhere else?
Oh wow. Yeah, I was just thinking about this actually. I was thinking about books about islands, and I think there's a novel that was published last year, I think it may even be this, by someone called William Wall, an Irish writer, and it's called Grace's Day, and it's set on 3 different islands, and it's absolutely beautiful, and it is like being there, and he's a magical writer, and I'm just astonished that more people haven't read it. It's so good. I think he was once shortlisted for the Booker for something actually.
Oh, okay.
I think, but I mean, but he's, for some reason no one's kind of noticed this amazing book, so I'd recommend that. I mean, I would love to recommend Charmian Cliff's books, but they're
Okay.
completely out
They
of
stand the
print.
test of time then, do that was one of my questions I was thinking.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. She could be writing today. I mean, when you read her essays, she could be writing about women's lives today. I mean, it's both tragic that not as much has changed as one might hope, and also it's sort of rather wonderful that she was able to do that. I mean, her concerns are our concerns. She's quite an extraordinary writer, I think.
Well, I shall read that then, because and the cover's so amazing with her bruised eye.
Yeah.
Isn't it? It's extraordinary. One last question for you, please. Joel Boatswain asks you, as a lyricist, do you find you're often inspired by music while writing? And is there a particular song lyric which has influenced your book, any of your books, or vice versa?
Well, I could probably answer that with not quite the answer. So all I do, I mean, I just listened to Leonard Cohen endlessly when I wrote this book, and actually, I had him in my headphones when I was walking. I do a lot of walking when I'm thinking, and he was just there. And I got into such a thing that I started thinking he was actually talking to me. It was. I get into sort of quite a mad state sometimes when I'm really in the writing. And so yes, Leonard Cohen consistently and all the time. But the other thing about this book is that it's a song of its own, because that's when I didn't know I was going to write this line, and it's something that Charmian says, and it's seen when they're in the cemetery, and Erica says to her, Charmian, do you believe in ghosts? And she says, oh yes, I have ghosts, not all of them dead. And as I type the words, because I very much sort of get into this thing of hearing Charmian, I suddenly thought, wow, that's sort of extraordinary. And I got a sort of chill when I sort of typed it. And so I wrote it on a piece of paper, and then I sort of looked at it at the end of the writing day, and I thought, no, there's a song in that. There's really a song in this idea of missing people in the way and being haunted by them, even though they're not dead. These people where once had a rupture in a relationship, that way that, you know, you're more conscious of them than of dead people, really, in terms of how much you miss them, but also that feeling that you might see them, that total haunting. And so, as soon as I finished the book, I wrote that lyric, and then David wrote a piece of music, and that song was about to be released. We were just going to do the last bit. We had a backing vocalist booked and a fiddle player, and they were just going to come down and do those last two bits. And then the lockdown happened, and so this song is sort of there waiting to get out.
Haunting you still.
Yeah, it's absolutely. I'm dying for people to hear this song, but we just want to finish it with these last two things, you know, because obviously the backing vocals are really kind of vital to it. And the fiddle player had done such a lovely kind of mock-up that we want to get him in to do it, and so it's slightly frustrating having this song that nobody can hear.
Oh God, how annoying. Well, thank you for your amazing book. I mean, this is not
Thank you.
Thank you. I've so enjoyed it. It was absolutely beautiful. It was like it was being on a sort of lounger. I mean, I thought I was actually at the party, which is so I mean, the perfect feeling.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you for doing this. This is a brilliant idea. Really, I mean, it's a lot of work, I think.
It is at the moment, yes. We will. Yeah. We'll see. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
And, thank you. And please, can we speak to you again?
Anytime. Yeah, let's do this. Do this regularly.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Polly.
Bye. Bye.